My name is Bob McClure, and I'm the president and CEO of the James Madison Institute, which is Florida's free market think tank. And we are grateful to Lisa and to Alec and all of your team for all you're doing and for being here in the Sunshine State. And so I also want to introduce, and Steve can introduce himself, Steve Crisafulli, who was a former Speaker of the House in 2014, from 2014 to 2016, and looking forward to hearing more from you.
No, thanks, and welcome to Florida. Thank you for having me. You know, the last time I was at ALEC was in 2012, and I think we were in a ballroom on the side of Bourbon Street in North Carolina, or in New Orleans, that sat probably about 200 people. So to see the amount of engagement here this week is impressive. So congratulations to the team at ALEC. Congratulations to Chair Basada on all of y'all's efforts and your successes and continuing to grow this organization. It makes a difference. I'll tell you, I just left from South Florida. We had RSLC. I have the great pleasure of chairing that organization. And we had about 800 people show up for that event. And I will tell you, the energy is there for what's coming up in November, and continuing this message, as Demi was saying, of free principles and being committed to small government is paying off in the states. And I will tell you, I think in November we will see successes from that. So look forward to speaking with y'all today.
I also want to acknowledge my staff, who is also here from the James Madison Institute. Just briefly raise your hand if you're with the JMI team, and thank you all for that. And if you want to learn more about the great state of Florida, talk to our folks at the James Madison Institute and any one of our fabulous legislators who are in the room. Speaker, let's go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about this. You were Speaker of the House from 2014 to 2016. And a lot of people think that Florida has become the free state of Florida, like it's an overnight success. But we know, all of us, that that's not true. When you became Speaker, moving forward to today, how has the state changed, and how have we gotten to be where we are today?
It's a good question, Bob, and I think, what's important to recognize coming into 2014-16 is we were coming out of the Great Recession. And there were tough decisions that were made by leaders well before me, and those same decisions have been made by leaders after me. But one thing stands true, and it's the philosophy of what the leaders in Florida have come to, and it's fiscal discipline, limited government, and focusing on the people of the state and recognizing that government is not the answer. And we've got a great contingent of Florida legislators here today, and there's been tough decisions that they've had to make. They're going to continue to make tough decisions, but what we knew in 2014-16 is we had to stand firm on those principles. There were going to be things that would come before us that would tempt us to go after additional federal money or whatever it might be with Medicaid expansion or something along those lines. And the reality was, my first budget that I voted for in the legislature when I was a freshman member was cutting the budget by $6 billion. That's with a B. We went from a $78 billion budget to a $72 billion budget because we didn't have the means to continue to spend like we were because of what we were going through. And what we found was there were no negative impacts to the state. And we stayed focused on those disciplines throughout my speakership and the speakerships to follow. And that's why Florida is set where it is today, because of the philosophy that we believe that we should govern on.
I'll say this as well. We at the James Madison Institute don't, by and large, hire, quote, politicians, end quote, to work with us at JMI. But this speaker, as you just heard, is a movement conservative. And I think that's what's critically important, and that's why he's a scholar in residence with the James Madison Institute. We've cut our budget 3 years in a row. The governor has referenced that. It's, in a state of 23 million plus. Our budget's about where New York City is, a little bit more. New York City's a city of 8 million. As we move into other issues beyond just government spending, election reform, for example, we're very familiar with what happened with Bush v. Gore. We were all there. We were the butt of every joke, the humiliation of the country, hanging chads, we all know that. Fast forward to our most recent election, We have almost 1,000 people moving here a day, 2 different time zones, 23 million people. Every demographic in the country is in the state, reflected in the state of Florida. And yet we know by 10 p.m., maybe midnight, who's won every race up and down the ballot in our state. How did we go from Bush v. Gore, and then during your time as Speaker, what did you do that was significantly important to the success of where we are today?
Well, Bob, I'll tell you, it was the 2003 session, I believe, that changed Florida's, elections for the good for years to come. And thankfully, Jeb Bush recognized the challenges we had. And the reality is, it was a statewide voter registration. It was optical scan ballots and making sure that we had a process set up to audit those ballots post-election. It was making sure we had professional staff that were, educated and understood the process. We extended voting for early voting. I mean, right now in Florida, we have early voting that leads up to the elections where a lot of people take part in that. And I don't mean mail-in ballots. I mean showing up places to actually vote. And it takes the pressures off of Election Day. But along with that, the crazy thing is we have to show our ID when we go and vote. Now, that was in place before 2003, but they made those standards a little stricter with signature, verification, and then making sure that IDs were validated. So, encompassing all of that and moving forward today, you're right. I mean, by 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, we go to bed knowing who we voted for versus California that are weeks later. So, there are states around this country that could learn from what Florida's successes have been.
Yeah, and I would add this as well. Since we've instituted these reforms, when the left loves to say that somehow this is Jim Crow 2.0, actually it has increased voter turnout across the state and increased voter turnout among African Americans and Hispanics and underserved communities. So don't let the left tell you otherwise. It works. Florida has, shifting now to tax policy and a little bit more on spending, Florida has no state income tax. And I know a lot of states in this room who are represented are trying to move to either lower state income tax or no state income tax. It's a friendly competition, I think, in a lot of states that border one another. You compare that to, say, a New York, an Illinois, a California. How has Florida, with the legislative process, been able to govern, continue to cut spending, to make tough decisions, as you said, during the 08-09, crisis? What advice would you give legislators and leaders in various states on how we've been able to do those things, given our relatively very light tax policy?
Sure. I think consistency and predictability is what businesses around the country look for, and with those two things alone, you will see capital follow along. And I believe in Florida, that's what we've done. As I've said, the consistency of leadership in Florida, and we're unique to some degree. We have term limits, so every 2 years we've got a new speaker in the House or a new president in the Senate, and we are still able to maintain the consistency and predictability that businesses are looking for. And that's why you're seeing at record paces, businesses coming into the state. And as you mentioned, a population that continues to grow each and every year. When I came into office, I think we were bringing in 600 people or so a day. Up until last year, I think we were about 1,600 people a day coming to this state. And they're looking for those policies, and they're looking for the consistency that we bring in those policies. And I think that other states, if they're looking for those opportunities, it's that predictability that I think that families as well as businesses are looking for, along with, yes, we have great advantages of a geographic location, we've got a great climate, we've got a great school system. We talk about school choice and what we've done in Florida over the last several years with school choice, but that's been something that we've been paving the way on for many years. And because of that, we have families that are looking to be here to take advantage of those opportunities. And look no further than COVID and the people that came to the state to have an opportunity to continue to educate their kids while other states were shut down. And because of these reforms and because of the consistency in our leadership, we've been able to build on that.
Given that success, I would say almost generational success, Florida is slated to pick up 3 to 4 more electoral votes in the 2030 census. Yes. States that value freedom, as the speaker said, that value capital, that's where you're seeing the electoral votes, where you're going to see them in 2030. They're moving to states like Florida and Texas and Utah and South Carolina. They're moving away from New York and Illinois and California. We've all heard the term live free or die. Americans are choosing to live free or move, and that's the truth. Speaker, moving on to the next question. We're told that Washington, D.C. cannot impose fiscal discipline on itself, and yet we've done it in Florida. Can you give an example of maybe a time where it was hard to say no, where you had to make the really tough decisions, and yet Florida still continues to become more and more a red state? We're not losing, elections because of it. Talk about how Washington at the congressional level can emulate the tough decisions when things get difficult.
Well, the beauty in Florida is we do have a balanced budget, and that's where we have to start, and that's just the reality of the situation. But I will tell you, as a leader, as even some of the legislators sitting in this room that are appropriations chairs and the subcommittees and in the big committees, there's a lot of times where you have to say no. There's a lot of times a legislator will walk in and say, this is the only way I can get reelected. But the reality is we have to be disciplined in our spending. And I will, without naming names, I will tell you I had a legislator that came in and asked for a $50 million appropriation. Now in 2014, that was a big deal. In 2026, it's still a big deal. But the reality was she felt like it would get her unelected if she didn't bring this home. And I just kind of kept preaching to her that it's the message that you go to the door with that gets you reelected, not the money you bring back to your district. But the reality was, it was the end-all, be-all for her and several folks in the delegation, but we had to stay focused. And I was a small business guy. I mean, I looked at ROI before I did anything. The first bill I ever ran was scoring legislative appropriations, because that's what we do in a daily activity in our family business back at home. So recognizing that we had to have ROI in our expenditures was important to me. And at the end of the day, saying no can be difficult, but you have to live within your means. The fiscal discipline is what got Florida to where it is today. It'll get Florida to where it goes in the future. And while sometimes it's not the popular thing to do to say no, it is the right thing, and that's just the reality sometimes in leadership.
We have a saying at the James Madison Institute that good policy is good politics. And what we mean by that is if you implement what the speaker is talking about from a policy standpoint, the opportunity to get elected or reelected becomes easier. It still takes your hard work. And I'll add this one more thing as it relates to that issue. During COVID, you remember that our governor was the first state in the country to reopen, and our legislature and our leaders in the state supported him on this issue under withering criticism. And obviously he's been vindicated. But it takes that kind of courage to advance good policy. And when you do that, it also is good politics. And that's exactly what the speaker's talking about as well when it comes to spending. What's the connection, kind of in your view, Speaker, between the limited government approach and the economic growth we've seen in Florida? A lot of people say, as you said, that $50 billion appropriation, What's the connection between limiting government and economic growth? Are they cause and effect? Is Florida just lucky? Are we importing money? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it goes hand in hand. And as I mentioned, yes, we have great advantages with our geography, with our climate, but so does California. Admittedly, I was out there a couple of weeks ago, and I think the weather and the coastline are beautiful, but the politics are horrific. And I think we recognize that, and it's because of failed leadership and failed decisions and the inability to be fiscally constrained and focused on what makes your state great. And again, as I've said, and can't say it enough, the consistency in the policies in Florida and the consistency in the leadership allows you to balance that out and focus on what it means to continue to advance Florida in the direction that we have. And those tax policies that we speak of, I mean, we used to have annually, we would vote on tax policies that we would renew each and every year. Now those are built into the budget as reoccurring funding. And we've done that because we've been able to slowly chip away at making sure that we know what's important to our citizens in the state. We know what's important to the business sectors. And we've been able to do that through consistency in our policy making.
With all the great things that are happening, what do you see potentially as the biggest threat to our freedom in the state of Florida? And obviously using that as a potential warning for other states as well.
Well, I think it's getting off track and losing focus or seeing a shiny object that looks, inviting. And, for me, that was Medicaid expansion. Washington, D.C. was touting that, pushing it down to the states. And, we just weren't having it in Florida. We did not see that that was something that we needed to do. And thank God we didn't. It would have put us in a different fiscal environment for years to follow. Truth is, I gavelled out a session early because my counterpart in the Senate at the time wanted to expand Medicaid. And we weren't able to go any further in the legislative session. We couldn't talk about allocations for our budget process. And I just made the decision that that was the thing to do, was separate ourselves from this conversation, go back home, talk to our constituents, find out what's important to them, come back in Tallahassee and pass a budget. And the reality was we just weren't distracted by the outside forces. And at the time, that was additional money to go into a healthcare budget that we just did not need. And again, when we look in the rearview mirror, we see that we made the right decision.
As we kind of begin to wrap up this conversation, I like to tell folks on a national level, yes, the Republican Party kind of owns everything in the state of Florida. Obviously, it hadn't been that way forever. It took 30 years to become an overnight success. But what I also like to say is, and I've used this term already, is that the leaders in this room, the men and women who have led this state, they're movement conservatives. They're not Republicans per se. Clearly they are. But there is a movement conservatism that has really began kind of with Jeb Bush and all the fights we had early on with Jeb as governor. So obviously the Republican component is incredibly important, but it's movement conservative leadership. As we wrap up this conversation today, if a legislator from another state came to you tomorrow and said, hey, I want what Florida has, what would you tell them?
I'll go back to where I started. It's the philosophies of the leadership of our state. I wouldn't go look at our statutes. I would look at our philosophies, and I would base what's right for your state off of those philosophies. Limited government, fiscal discipline, brings you a long way in this world. And again, not everybody has the advantages of, the geography that I spoke of or the climate that I speak of. But you can certainly entrench those fiscal disciplines into a caucus and continue to build off of them. And I truly believe, based on the successes of Florida, that those are places that other states can build their successes off of as well.
Let us not forget that the left loves to say that the more and more diverse a state becomes, it will be naturally more blue. Florida gives the lie to that, given our demographics, our leadership, and our leadership in this room. Mr. Speaker, any final thoughts or comments for everyone here at ALEC?
No, thank you for having me again. I think it's a great conversation. It's certainly what this organization is built on, is the philosophies of smaller government, fiscal discipline, and the realities of today. We need to make sure, and I say this everywhere I go now, it used to be that the policies drove the politics. we're seeing more and more that politics are driving policies. And I think that becomes a very dangerous area because we're trying to look at a populist approach or we're trying to appease a different group of people. Just remember the foundation of where we come from and how we got to where we are with the successes we've had. And you don't have to look any further than that to realize that the philosophy that this organization is built on is one of success for many states around this country.
And if we at the James Madison Institute can ever be of service to you in your state, please reach out. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.